Hey everyone, so today's video is going to be a bit different and a bit of a serious discussion video. I wanted to talk about diversity in writing and particularly own voices as well as the fear of diversity. I have been seeing a few conversations going around on AuthorTube and I sort of wanted to make a video of my own, and I believe these conversations have been going on Twitter. I don't use Twitter, so I am not really well versed on what's going on there. I have heard from these videos, like Alexa Dunn's video, like Lizelle Sambury's video, that these conversations have been going on. Some of you might be aware, I guess, that there's more talk about diversity and who should be writing what stories on Twitter, and now I'm sort of seeing some of these videos popping up on AuthorTube. I know Kate Kavanaugh posted a video today, and I also saw another one from, I think it's Savvy Writes Books, that I watched today, so I wanted to sort of add my 2 cents to this conversation, and I just want to give a disclaimer before I get into this video, because these thoughts are thoughts that I've had for a while. It's not based off of like any one person's video. If Alexa or any of the other people that I mentioned are watching this video, just so you guys know, this is not supposed to be any sort of critique on them. I actually really appreciated that I can see this conversation going around. I think it's vital. So I mentioned Alexa's video in particular because I left a comment on it, and I will be quoting that comment just because it was an essay. I'm so sorry, Alexa, if you watch this. I don't think she knows who I am, but if she sees this video, I'm sorry I left an essay in your comments. But because I was as eloquent as I think I can be on my positioning, I thought I would just quote what I said instead of trying to say it again. Me looking off the side is going to be pretty common in this video. Writing diversely has really impacted me, first of all, as a diverse writer. If y'all didn't know, I'm mixed Guyanese. I am a diverse writer myself. To be somebody who crosses tons of intersections, I kind of wanted to add my 2 cents, I guess. So before we get into the video, I think what would be most helpful would be to define own voices. So own voices was a term coined by Corinne Duvis. She created the hashtag own voices, I believe, on Twitter. I'm going to read a section that I believe she wrote on her website. The link for all of my sources are going to be in the description. So the question is this about race, queerness, disability? What counts? Do you think this character/author combo counts? What about a situation where, etc., etc.? And Corinne says, remember what I said about not wanting to moderate or regulate the hashtag? Use it for whatever marginalized/diverse identity you want. I personally like the WNDB definition, which is as long as the protagonist and the author share a marginalized identity. She expands author as in the actual author has this identity, not their spouse, child, sibling, parent, student, neighbor, friend, so on. Identity as in at least somewhat specific. Aim for character and author are both blind, and character and author are both African American, rather than character is blind and author is autistic, thus both are disabled. And character is African American and author is Korean American, thus both are people of color. She gives you an example of what may count and what wouldn't count. And a marginalized identity, not all. Sometimes a character will be part of a group the author isn't. For example, a neurotypical Muslim author writing an autistic Muslim protagonist. As long as there's a marginalized aspect of their identity they do share, it's hashtag own voices. So that is what the creator of the hashtag had to say about own voices. I first want to start this video off by talking about the difference that I believe exists between own voices and general diversity/representation. In my opinion, from the above definition, I believe own voices and general diversity/representation are not synonymous, and I actually believe that the treatment that they are synonymous is the cause of a lot of discourse. Own voices stories to me will incorporate identity as an ingrained part of the story. Therefore, having a space for writers who are marginalized to write that particular story is very important, and the category existing is helpful for that reason. A white writer writing and publishing, and I'm going to highlight publishing, an own voices style story outside of their marginalization is where things get a bit dicey. Diversity in general representation to me seems to focus less on the identity, particularly of the character, in relation to their cultural background, therefore not requiring congruency between the writer and the character. However, And I'm going to say this. Good representation, in my opinion, still incorporates identity. So the character does not just become their race, their sexuality, their disability, or so on, which would be tokenism. Good representation won't also just basically be a white character in a POC body. I'm going to read my example just because it's a bit longer. I said good representation is not writing a Guyanese character. I use Guyanese as an example because I'm Guyanese. So good representation is not writing a Guyanese character like a white person. Culture still informs the character and therefore aspects of the story, but the story may not be particularly about the significance of a particular identity. Just as my personal life is not always about race, though my experiences always have been and always will be, whether or not I know it or not, informed by my race. I think it also depends on what your story is about. So for example, this is another example that is literally using me as an example. If you're writing about a character like me, who grew up in a very diverse city. I'm from Toronto, but it's a coming of age story, and the main character moves from this very diverse city to this primarily white city. Even if the storyline isn't about this struggle with feeling accepted in this new city and is actually like a love story, those feelings still need to be brought up in some form. And there isn't really a harsh line on whether or not that story would be considered own voices. It's a contemporary story, so it wouldn't make sense if I was the main character and I moved away from Toronto to a primarily white city and I didn't notice that everybody else around me was white. That's not realistic, and I know that because that happened to me. It's true. When I moved away last year for university, I'm not there anymore, I'm back home, but when I was at university, I noticed immediately that I was not like everybody else who was there. So if you're writing contemporary, and even I think, in other stories that are not contemporary, you need to keep that in mind because you can't strip an identity from somebody. The story doesn't need to be about how that identity particularly affects the plot. You need to keep aspects of the identity in mind. You don't want to just write a white character inside of a person of color's body. Again, there isn't really a harsh line about what is own voices or who is in own voices, who should tell that story. It really depends on the purpose of the story. It's not that the character will not notice that they're the only brown person, for example, in the room of white people. For me, I as a person of color very much understand and notice when I'm the only brown person in a room that is otherwise filled with only white people. The reason I notice is because I grew up in a very, very diverse area and also grew up watching media, reading media that didn't represent me, and so I couldn't fully relate to everything or see myself reflected in the world around me. And I noticed that even from a very young age. I'm talking below 10 years old. So you have to keep that in mind as well. I am not authority over all people of color. I am a person of color, but I am no authority. We are not a monolith. We might have multiple different opinions. There's some people of color who are going to disagree with what I say and what I will go on to say, and that's okay. I encourage conversation, but this is more so for my white viewers who have a lot of fear. And so I wanted to make this video just to talk about this because I've been thinking a lot about it, especially the last few days, but always. Diversity hasn't always been easy for me, and I will talk about that later. So I think by synonymizing the term own voices with diversity/representation, we are inadvertently in some way suggesting that people of color can only really have issue stories. Not to say that all own voices stories are issue stories. I don't think that that's true, but this is just an example, especially with, in my opinion, how own voices stories are marketed by publishers. This is obviously not true. We don't just have issue stories. We don't live our lives like issues. Some diverse books and writers might not even want to touch on these issues because they might want to create a safe space for diverse people when they're reading, diverse teenagers, diverse children when they're reading. Don't they deserve to have fun, to fall in love, to go on adventures, and so on and so forth? Not to mention, there are a lot of diverse writers like myself who do oppositely, basically writing with white characters. How would we tackle that issue? A point that I will bring up later, which is going to be about white equaling the safe lane to take. I also wanted to bring up a bit of a sub-point within this point, that this synchronization of the two terms might also reinforce a bit of a monolith that all diverse writers have the same experience. One size obviously does not fit all. That's why some OwnVoices books may resonate with you and others may not. It's also why people who are not writing OwnVoices might write the same marginalization as you, and you might resonate with that work even though they're not part of that group. And I'm just going to read this bit because it's a bit spicy and it is a little bit harsh, but I mean it in the best way possible because I think there's a lot of concern and fear, and I just want to sort of put that in perspective by what I'm going to read next. If you are not willing to do the work of treading the delicate line, and sometimes it is a harsh line, more oftentimes than not, there can be quite a stark line, but I'm going to refer to it as a delicate line because it can feel that way. It can feel like, is this the right thing? Is that the wrong thing? I am referring to that line, and you, if you've had this struggle, probably know what line I am referring to. If you're not willing to tread the delicate line between determining an OwnVoices story versus a diverse story acceptable for you to write, even if you're outside of the marginalization, which includes being willing to make mistakes and listening to those in the marginalization, you, in my opinion, are not ready to write a diverse story empathetically, nor are you ready to be in the publishing industry, in my opinion, which is an industry that serves the public, and the public is diverse. If you're not willing to understand that a story may not be appropriate for you to write, if you're not willing to interrogate that line, to understand that, hey, this story wouldn't be appropriate for me to write, but I can still write a character of this race, determining that, if you're not willing to interrogate these things, to do research, I don't think you're ready for diverse stories, and I also don't think you're ready for publishing in general. I can't say if you're ready for writing or not, because I think we can write what we want. Publishing what we want is another story, because publishing what we want might not be what is best for other people and what is best for respecting other cultures. So we can write what we want. Do I think that you're ready for that if you're not ready to interrogate the nuances of these situations, that somebody from a marginalization might come to you? Would you get defensive about that? So now I'm going to be moving on to an article. I'll read the title. It was written by Hannah Heath, and it is 5 problems within the OwnVoices campaign and how to fix them. So I'm going to read a quote from a commenter, and the commenter quoted a Black author, and so the quote is going to be a quote of a quote. Quote, "Yes, write Black characters, but when you query, consider how publishers are behaving." That was the quote within the quote. Basically, his advice was to avoid publishers who only put out books about minorities written by non-minorities, publishers who have had bad track records when it comes to hiring minorities and the like. Look instead for those who are making an effort to publish OwnVoices books and books by underrepresented authors, end quote. Hannah has a few points in this article. I'm not going to go in depth on Hannah's points. If you would like to read more, if something intrigues you, I would just read the article. The points: it shuts down representation. It assumes that writers are not capable of writing a story about somebody who is different from themselves. It is policing who can write what stories. And the point to me that was the most relevant: it needs to expand to deal with a larger problem, which would be publishers. Quote, "I've heard this mentioned a lot. Non-OwnVoices shouldn't attempt to write about underrepresented groups because if they get published, they are taking that publication opportunity away from an OwnVoices writer. This is operating out of the assumption that publishers only publish a specific number of diverse stories," essentially like a quota. "Sadly, this is an accurate assumption." I completely agree with that. I think it is an accurate assumption. However, and this is the part I very want to highlight for you guys, however, the solution is a poor one. Because few diverse books are published, writers should write less diverse books. And that's the quote. I think that is a very important point. I have seen in a few videos, and obviously we're going to talk about this later, it's going to be staying in your own lane. I just want to highlight that to you since we're talking about OwnVoices, a potential problem. Do I think that OwnVoices is a problem in itself? No, I don't. I think it was a mechanism created for underrepresented voices to be heard. Do I think it has problems? From the stories that I read on the articles that I will link in the description, I think clearly there's some sort of a problem. Not really the movement. I think the movement was trying its best. I think some people may be taking it a little bit too far in trying to help others, and then that help is actually just unhelpful because what's being done is what is believed to be the best thing, when in reality the best thing has not been done because nobody's been asked, what is it that you need? Another part of this article that I really liked goes as follows: representation, whether it takes the form of own voice or non-own voice authors, is important. We cannot cater to publishing houses and their propensity to overlook entire groups of people when publishing fiction. Instead, we as writers need to be telling stories that are reflective of the real world. Stories about characters of all identities, and we as readers need to be actively requesting that publishers do a better job of publishing said stories, unquote. We need to be putting more responsibility on publishers, because how do stories get out into the world? There's a quote, I think from The Hunger Games, and I say this because I just rewatched The Hunger Games and my sister has been listening to the audiobooks, so I've been thinking about The Hunger Games. There's like a quote that's like, remember who the real enemy is. And I think that's a quote, something like that. I'm not saying that publishers are as evil as a dystopian government. However, I think the idea can apply here. I think we want to talk to each other about these issues, but instead of talking about the actual problem, the root of the problem, the structural problem, we're talking about kind of the sprinkles on top, like the writers themselves. This is heavily interlaced in a structural problem, and I know that because publishers are the people putting out books. So if they're not putting out books written by diverse people, we can look at these surface level issues like white writers are writing diverse voices, and so they're getting published and taking away the diversity checklist quota, whatever. We can look at it in that way, or we can instead look at it as this is a structural problem. Publishers are doing this. They know what they're doing. They know they're not publishing diverse writers, and that's unacceptable. This is a quote from Sadia Faruqi, and her article is The Struggle Between Diversity and Own Voices, and the quote is, quote, "Whereas once upon a time we were worried about adequate representation of minority stories, now we have an added concern of who's writing those stories." End quote. That article will be in the description. I really liked this article from Refinery 29 written by Kat Rosenfield, and the article is "What is #OwnVoices doing to our books?" Quote is, quote, "Additionally, gatekeepers who consider themselves anti-racist allies can have troubling preconceptions of what marginalized people's stories should look like, and will pressure writers with different backgrounds to stick with issue books centered on oppression or injustice." Now, this is a quote within the quote that I'm reading you by Francina Simone, who is an amazing booktuber, author-tuber, I guess. "Issues are important for sure, but damn, can a bitch be entertained? Can I be black and be entertained?" says Francina Simone, a YA author whose YA debut, Smash It, will be released by Incured Press next year. "Sometimes my blackness is a struggle, but that doesn't mean my whole life is. Imprints want those kinds of books, but it's feeding the crowd who wants, I don't want to call it trauma porn, but it kind of is." So that was Francina's quote within the quote. Back to what Kat was saying. "But there's still time for the industry to course correct, not by sacrificing its focus on diversity, but by relinquishing its stranglehold on the stories themselves. A colorful and creative future lies in welcoming and supporting authors from all backgrounds, and then letting them use their voices to tell whatever kinds of stories they want." End quote. And, this article in particular, I highly recommend that you read this if you want to read some of the, pitfalls of the Own Voices movement and people who have had their books canceled, who have been canceled, and just sort of the other side. I think it's an important movement, but I don't think things that are important are without their flaws. Now I'm going to be talking about some statistics. So this is from Lee and Low, and it's their diversity baseline survey results for 2019. I want to talk about this because one of my points is that children need diversity. And so let's look at some statistics for children's books. The survey was about publishing in general, and so the following numbers that I'm going to read to you are numbers based off of the overall industry, but if you check out the graph that they have on the website, which will be linked in the description, there's also a breakdown by employees, by authors, and stuff like that. So this is just overall. So 76% of the industry is white, 74% of the industry of that are cis women, 81% are straight, and 89% are non-disabled. If we look particularly at the numbers, we see that the industry is primarily white straight women who are able-bodied. In particular, as you can probably tell, I'll be discussing race in this video because that's what's most pertinent to me. However, the arguments that I'm making can definitely be made for sexuality, disability, so on. So this is the problem. White people are disproportionately getting published to write diverse stories, whereas actual diverse voices are not. So the solution is to only have people of color write POC characters so that the publishing industry will publish their diverse stories and not white writers' diverse stories, right? That's the problem and the solution. So many white people are getting published to write diverse stories. The actual diverse voices are not. Wouldn't it make sense to only have POC write POC stories? Publishers wouldn't just fulfill their quota on a white writer and fulfill their quota, I guess, in a sense, with the diverse writer's work. So I find this idea a little bit problematic, and that's kind of why I wanted to make this video, because to me, I think this idea will cause more harm than it will good. And I'm going to talk about it not because the idea itself is bad. I think the idea itself is positive. I think it comes from people believing it will help, wanting to help, desperately trying to help. I think it's coming from allies who care, and I appreciate that. However, I think we need to be keeping in mind structural histories. We need to be keeping in mind statistics and the current situation, the current climate of the publishing industry in order to make a productive move to help people of color. I also think people of color need to be involved in that sort of discussion, which is why I'm here, just to chat. But again, I am not the speak-all for all people of color. Some of you might disagree with me who are fellow people of color, and so this is just my opinion. I think this mindset, while in theory seems appealing, and it does make sense, like I said. We need to look at the current breakdown of the publishing industry, which is majorly white, and we need to keep that in mind before we make decisions like POC should be the only ones writing POC main character stories or POC in general. Question I have: how are diverse writers supposed to thrive in an industry that is primarily white? The answer to this question, I think, is that the industry itself needs to change. White writers now only writing white stories with white characters will only lead to an influx of white stories because the industry is a white saturated industry. It will not, on the other hand, lead to a saturation of diverse stories by diverse writers because the industry itself is toxic and needs to be rerouted structurally and systemically, as it is founded on racism or at the very least white supremacy. This is a quote from myself that I left in a comment, like I said, on Alexa Dunn's video. To quote myself, quote, "Such a micro look on an industry that has been and currently is majorly white will only cause an influx of primarily white stories as the industry stays white, except now the majority of white writers will not write people of color because it's outside of their lane, so any semblance of diversity we had before is shredded." To clarify my point, I do not think that white writers being the only ones publishing diverse stories is what is needed, but the industry itself seems to have a problem with publishing diverse voices or actively seeking diverse voices, uplifting diverse voices in volume as the same volume. And that's why I bring this up, because I worry that what will happen with this idea of stay in your lane is white people will see that and they will be like, okay, I want to respect people of color and allow them to tell their stories, whatever that may be. And so I will just write a white main character. And I think that comes from a place of heart. It comes from a place of empathy. However, I don't think it's necessarily helpful because this industry has and always will publish white people and publish white stories. It's been like that for centuries. I think the majority of the industry, which we've already gone over, is what? 76% white. The 76% majority of the industry writing only in their lane could have extreme detriments to the diversity that we already have. Not that I think, like I said, white people having the only diverse stories on the market is acceptable. I don't think that that's acceptable. Do you understand what I'm saying? If the industry itself is already so white, how do we expect writing within our lane is going to help before we make a change that actually lets people of color into the industry? Another resource that I just want to quickly shout out here is Who Gave You the Right to Tell That Story by Vulture. It has some interesting opinions in it. Not everything I agree with. It's basically just a testimonial style interviews of different people from different cultural backgrounds, some people of color, some white people, talking about diversity and writing diversity, writing outside of your lane. And I think it's really interesting. I highly recommend checking it out. So now we're going to get into my points. And the first point was a really big thing in my comment that I left, and that is reframe writing in your own lane to widening the lane. And here's a quote for myself. Quote, I think it can be a bit reckless despite being well-intentioned to suggest writers not write outside their intersections, considering the climate of the current publishing industry being primarily white. Wouldn't this result in more only white stories? And I say that not because the publishing industry would be like, okay, now only white people are writing white stories, so we're going to specifically just publish only POC stories. We've seen how the publishing industry works. They publish white people, and they have been doing so. They're the only ones in this world with the power to traditionally publish a manuscript. You have to go through the publishing industry to traditionally publish. Obviously, self-publishing is a different conversation. Publishing and the publishing industry has the control about who they let in and how many of those people they let in. The publishing industry as is doesn't give people of color enough room to write diverse characters. Also, noting that I don't think any person of color must write an issue story or OwnVoices story, and equating issue stories and like diversity in general with OwnVoices, like diverse writer equals OwnVoices, is a problem for me. I think somebody coming to me and assuming that all I write is Guyanese characters about my exact experience or whatever, that is not true for me, and I have an issue with people assuming that, not because I dislike myself, but because that's not what I'm writing. Maybe I will write that in the future, but I think making that assumption is saying a lot of things, whether or not you notice that or not. And I think being aware of your assumptions is really important too. So back to the fact that the publishing industry doesn't give people of color enough room in general. That's what we need to change. I think more weight needs to be put on the industry rather than individual writers, because without rerouting how the industry functions itself, true diversity and equity in publishing will not be achieved. So we have to dig deep structurally to fix this problem. Getting writers to stop writing outside of their lane is not going to do anything. It is the industry that needs to change, because if the publishing industry actually cared about diversity, if they cared about children having representation in the media, don't you think they would be publishing more diverse books? This riles me up because as somebody who's heavily affected by colorism, thankfully I love who I am now. I love my skin tone. I love the person I am. I love my background. I love my family. I am proud of that. I know how difficult it is to be a child and not see yourself in representation. I'm getting off track, and I know I'm going to get to this point. However, I don't think having white writers write inside of their own lane, which essentially means write white characters, write main characters, whatever the semantics of this would be, I don't think that that's going to do much if we're not putting pressure on the industry that's going to publish the stories. So I've been hearing this idea of like we need to make space for years in publishing, like not even just on YouTube videos, for years when I used to use Twitter. These were things that I heard all the time. We need to make space. I think this idea of we need to make space needs to be specified. If you're white and you write a white story, and by white story I mean like a story with a white main character or mostly white characters because you don't want to take the space of a person of color, you're still unfortunately taking up a space because you're part of the dominant race and benefit from the structures of white supremacy built into the bones of publishing. A space that is unavailable or harder to attain for people of color that are writers. So is the solution here for white people to stop publishing? I don't think so. I think that would be ridiculous. I don't think that would be fair to tell white people, hey, you just gotta stop publishing your books to make more room. Absolutely not. I think, however, that this highlights the structural imperfections of the publishing industry that must be re-excavated to benefit not just the dominant race, but everybody. Do you guys get what I'm saying? I'm saying we need to look on a structural level. We can't be individualistic about this. While you can call your friend out for something racist they may have written in their book or something that you think is insensitive, there's nothing wrong with doing that on an interpersonal basis. I think, however, trying to shape an entire revolution in terms of like diversity in an industry on an individualistic basis, I think that that's unproductive. I don't think that's going to do anything. It's all about structures. And some of you might disagree with me, and let me know your opinions on the comments. I strongly believe that until we fix the structures, we cannot fix the sprouts on top. You need to fix the roots. Hence, I believe we should not stay in our lane, especially if you're white. I would use your privilege and your voice to widen the lane for those of us who have more difficulty breaking into the publishing industry due to our marginalizations. So on to the next point that I kind of hinted at, and that is children need diverse stories. More statistics. I'm going to read from some statistics from 2018. It's not the most recent, but that was 2 years ago, so it's pretty recent. In 2018, the Cooperative Children's Book Center compiled stats outlining the backgrounds of characters from diverse backgrounds from 3,134 books. Lots of books. So here are the stats. And so these are the representations of the characters. So 50% of the characters were white, 27% were animal/other, 10% were African/African American, 7% were Asian Pacific Islander/Asian Pacific American, 5% were Latinx, and 1% were Indigenous. I'm going to link that statistic by the CCBC and also more statistics that go in depth on representation from the CCBC as well in the description. Thinking about these numbers, how is this acceptable? Colorism is pervasive, like I said, and can be even traumatizing. I can only speak for myself again, but the lack of diversity in media for me growing up had such an effect on me, and it had consequences for how I viewed myself and my own skin tone. While I'm more than proud of, like I said, of myself, who I am right now, I love myself. I love who I am. I love how I look. I love my skin tone. I think I'm beautiful just the way I am. It's taken years of unlearning the particular shame of bearing the difficult but beautiful task of being a visible minority. Even though, in Toronto, we're the majority, but whatever, visible minority. I hate the term minority, I will say that. This has actually had impacts on my writing and my own diversity in my writing, which draws out into my works today, mostly because when I was still going through these things, I was writing with characters that I still write with now. And so that led to many all-white casts due to conditioning toward the white default. I'm not going to get too personal on here, but, not seeing representation. I started writing when I was a child. I was 12 when I started writing, and I was still dealing with colorism at this time and feeling not right with how I looked. I wanted so badly to look not like the way I do. I had a friend tell me that was racist of me to feel that way. I don't think if you were a victim of colorism because of society and media, I don't think that you were racist for that. I'm trying my best to combat that, but that was a really difficult time for me personally. Growing up, not seeing media, it really normalizes the fact that you don't exist. It really normalizes that characters like you just don't exist. It normalizes that you just don't belong in movies, you don't belong in books. So a lot of the characters in my earlier work, and still now, because like I said, I've been writing a series from when I was 13 till now, and so that has carried through. Or all white. It's really hard to reckon with. You have to have an internal reckoning, like, what am I doing? How can I fix this? Can I fix this? Why do I feel this way? Things like that. It's not an easy task for a child to go through those things. And for the majority of this, I was a child when I was going through these things. I am now 18. I'm turning 19 in September. I am now confident with who I am, but even the effects are lasting because I still have those casts and they're still around. That's not really something I hear many people talk about, the pervasiveness of colorism in writing, especially from people of color. And, it is something that I feel ashamed of. I feel bad about it. I feel like I'm failing myself and failing my community in a sense. I'm trying to do better every single day, but I need to emphasize to you that children know what race is. Children absolutely need diversity. When I was in a gender studies class, I had a discussion. We had discussions in that class. It was an introduction to gender studies. And my professor, was hosting this discussion. One of the girls was like, I don't think we should teach kids about race because kids they don't know anything about race. They're too innocent to teach about race. And, I told the class, I don't think that's true. I think children are very smart because as somebody who was very aware of their race before they even knew what race was, race is a very relevant issue to children. For the kids, I think sometimes we forget who we're talking about because YA has been so oversaturated with adults, which is another issue in itself. I think we forget who these stories are for. These stories are for the children, and they are for whether or not they're little children or they're older children, like teenagers. They're for kids, and we need to be diversifying these so that they can see themselves in media, especially if we're talking about kidlit. I don't write kidlit, but I'm still saying kids need diversity, especially since the majority of AuthorTube and I think the Twitter community is YA writers. Let's move on to the next one, which is stay in your lane as a harmful, albeit well-intentioned, mantra for people of color. So here's another quote from my comment. I said, I quote, "I wonder if this stay in your lane mindset could actually harm POC creators and also POC consumers, as A, it may create an expectation that all stories from writers of color are about issues, therefore creating an expectation for the role a writer of color should play in publishing. B, it may remove some positive representation for media out of an attempt to make more space for diverse writers to replace it with more white media. If we have a majority white industry, asking that industry to only write within their lane, at least for main characters, may result in even less diversity, because the publishing industry is very white saturated and has made very little effort to change that, and there's lots of statistics on that are linked in the description. What's to say the publishing industry wouldn't just publish these white stories written by those who didn't want to overstep, and all POC children had to read were stories they couldn't place themselves in? What would we do in that case? Because I'm thinking about the industry doing what they've done for a century and only publishing white people, and if those white people are only writing with white characters, that's the only representation that POC kids are gonna see. And that is kind of similar to what I grew up with. I mean, there wasn't too much representation. It wasn't as bad, I don't think, because I'm younger Gen Z 2001er. So there was a little bit more diversity, but primarily the most popular books were all white characters. Which, I mean, to be fair, I didn't really read YA for very long, but Marie Lu was probably the only one that I can think of. Another quote from what I said: "I wonder if we need to make structural space for writers of color to attain actual opportunities rather than making space by not writing outside of our intersections so there's no overstepping, when the structural problems probably wouldn't be changed, as those spaces left could be potentially refilled with non-diverse media. I fear writing only within one's own lane may lead to an influx of white writers not writing diversely because they don't want to overstep, without ever once asking if they are actually overstepping. And because the publishing industry primarily publishes white people, having these stories be the only ones accessible, especially to kids." It's a smaller point, but I think it's kind of interesting to think about. To me, I think not allowing people to write outside of their intersections could also suggest that marginalized characters always will be sidekicks, almost. I understand the sentiment is that people who fall into those categories can write the stories themselves, but can you see, particularly with that the thinking is ingrained in creating more stories that uphold otherism? So I absolutely agree that there are certain stories that we should allow those in the appropriate marginalization to have ownership and to write. But I don't think it's a helpful idea, particularly even if well-meaning, to suggest we write in our own lane without mentioning the complex nuances that involves, and also the potential consequences for actual people of color, the people that you're trying to help, or without keeping in mind the current statistics of who the publishing industry is publishing right now and who they seemingly seem to care most about, which in this instance is white people, because 79% of the industry is white. So a viable solution I pose to this would be to hold publishers accountable, / the responsibility of publishers has more weight than the responsibility of the individual. So here's a quote again from myself. Quote, "I wonder if the solution would be to demand publishers widen their pool so that they can specifically seek writers of color and POC stories, as the volume of white writers / white characters is imbalanced. The solution, in my opinion, is not to tell white people to stop writing POC characters, whether that's main characters or not, emphasizing that writing POC and writing a person of color's own voice's story is not the same thing. So until this occurs, publishing will always exist on a framework of white hegemony, in my opinion." Again, I also want to bring up a counter argument just in case. I don't think that this is the numbers represent the population, because some people will say that, well, 79% of the publishing industry is white, and that's because most of the US is white, or whatever. I'm not sure I understand that argument, and I'm not sure how relevant that argument is to publishing, mostly because publishing is trying to pride itself on being diverse and representative, and they seem to really showcase that, like in advertisements for diverse books, for example, when in reality it's not. So I'm not sure. If you have that opinion, I'd like to hear, your thoughts on that, but I don't think it's as easy as, well, the numbers of the population versus this equate to that. And you can check out the numbers for yourself too. Another thing, looking at this issue from the framework of individualism causes great injustice in my opinion, as we cancel individual writers instead of the system that enables them. I'm not saying that writers that cause actual palpable harm by writing POC's own voices stories instead of leaving that space for a writer of color are not to blame, or in effect are not complicit in the overarching displacement of POC writers, because they definitely are. However, to make actual lasting change, the system must be uprooted and redesigned to foster the creativity of not just white people and diverse writers as the sprinkles on top, but in essence be remade to allow people of color to be active, wanted contributors to the industry. People of color are not additives. Marginalized people are not additives. So the second viable solution would be to uplift POC creators. I said, quote, "What I think would be productive and actually helpful for POC creators would be if white people uplifted POC creators instead of writing all white casts, because it's out of their lane. To me, having people stay in their lane for stories that aren't own voices seems to be a solution that will only fix the very surface level of this issue, when in reality, it is a publishing industry that needs to open its gates because they're the ones getting or not getting these stories out into the world. And we need to keep that in mind. The stories don't just appear. All the white stories don't just appear. All the diverse stories written by white people with no sight of diverse stories written by diverse people don't just appear. They are put there, they are bought, they are commodified, and they are sold by publishers. Publishers don't just find them. They have an active role in knowing who they're publishing. And we need to kind of, I think, put that at the forefront a little bit more. If you're a white booktuber, diversify your reading list and talk about these diverse books. Also, stop putting attention on white writers who aren't writing diversely enough, and put that energy of you giving them that attention toward a writer of color. If you're a white author tuber, make a conscious effort to be an ally to author tubers of color, a very small population, if I should say so myself, on all of AuthorTube. And AuthorTube's pretty small in itself, but it's very white dominated. So, do collabs, make an active effort to shout out their books, do things like that to show that you are genuinely caring. All of the main channels, I believe, biggest channels are white. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that they are mostly all white, if not all white. And so they're the ones getting the views. So if you are a white author tuber and you're watching this and you think you could do more, you probably are right. There probably is more that you could do. My next point is that it's important we don't make whiteness invisible / the safe route. And this is sort of linking back to something I hinted at before. Stay in your lane also concerns me because it obviously wouldn't be in reference to non-white people writing white characters, for example, like myself. This is understandable in terms of social justice because white people are not systematically oppressed because of the color of their skin in society. I bring this up not as a reverse racism argument, because I don't believe reverse racism exists. If you do, I highly recommend looking that up because it took some reading to understand. But because inadvertently this may suggest whiteness is a safe route, rendering any other ethnicity unsafe. So it may also enable whiteness as the default. This is what I said in my comment, quote, "If we see white as the default, we will make no progress as we need to see whiteness." I understand that white people are indeed not an oppressed group on the basis of their skin tone, so that's not what I'm commenting on, because in society it is safe to be white, but particularly that treating whiteness as the default safe lane may inadvertently other POC writers and stories written by people of color. As a writer of color, I'd really be disheartened to see white people only coming out with books with white characters because A, haven't we already been down that road? We have. I mean, all of the books on my shelf right now, I think from my YA days are mostly white. And B, kids, especially if we're referring to kidlit, need representation, like I said before. So white authors spearheading the industry, which they already do, they are the leaders of the industry, with more white stories in an industry that will always publish white stories doesn't seem like it will do much, because POC writers are already displaced in terms of numbers, but white writers won't be. I hope that makes sense. So if we start viewing writing a white character as the safe route, because in this instance it would basically be, I guess. I think that that can have some negative implications. That's why I think that needs to be a part of the conversation, because in a way I think the stay in your lane argument probably wouldn't apply to writing white characters, and so in essence we kind of are adding a bit of a safety belt, and that could actually cause, I think, more harm than good, because more writers could sort of not get away with, but I will say get away with sort of writing non-diversely because they're staying in their lane. So my next point is, I don't mean to be offensive by this. I really hate to weaponize the term woke as somebody who would define themselves as woke themselves. My next point is that well-intentioned white writers may be woking writers of color into oppression. You're woking us into oppression. If you are not part of a marginalized group, stop making decisions for marginalized people that you believe will help, even if well-intentioned. Use your power to actually have conversations with marginalized people and uplift what they want. You are not a spokesperson for us, and viewing yourself in this way, even if this is done accidentally, is unhelpful and merely harmful. And that's another point. I'm not a spokesperson for everybody. This is how I feel. So many are afraid of talking to people of color because they don't want to expel us of our emotional labor, but then go on to make a mistake that actually expels more emotional labor that wouldn't have been the case had they simply asked if we had the emotional labor to talk, instead of assuming our fragility. And this disclaimer, that's not what I'm saying that any of the other YouTubers who made videos or whatever were doing. This is just something that I've actually had happen to me in my personal life with multiple people. This is just something that I've noticed happens. People are kind of afraid to expel my emotional labor, that they may end up making a decision that, I would have preferred if they just came and asked me. That's not always the case, but I think practicing consent is important. I think this fear comes from this pretty recent, I guess I would say, I'd say recent as in it's gone around on social media, like on Instagram posts and stuff, that white people shouldn't depend on people of color to inform them on racism. And this is 100% true. I don't think that people of color are indebted to educate you. I don't think that's our responsibility. But I think that a lot of white people then fear that asking questions respectfully is a bad thing and will somehow make them be viewed as unwoke. So then they take it into their own hands to answer a question they don't have the experience to answer. And that can lead to some decisions that, while well-intentioned, may actually have some negative impacts on some people of color. My sister has this mantra, and I completely agree with it. Never view yourself as a perfect ally. It's very important that you are engaging in dialogues with people of color and are listening to people of color instead of trying to come up with your own conclusions based on your own findings that you believe to be correct. I've had to do this myself. It's mentally exhausting to have to continually explain that white privilege exists and its definitions, and at least for me, not generalizing, that's what white people need to inform themselves on. Definitional stuff. And validating, that these experiences are true and that they occur to us and that we have to handle them. But when it goes beyond that, having a friend who you trust and they trust you ask you a question, to me, at least in my personal experience, is never really offensive and much preferred than you making a misguided decision because you didn't want to offend anybody. And I think, like I said, it's kind of a thing on social media now. I'm not sure it's the message that's a problem. I think it might be the perception. There's this whole thing to not ask questions because now people of color shouldn't have to answer them. And I agree with that. There's no obligation, like I said. But if you want to have a conversation, there are also many of us who are willing to talk to you. You just have to ask, especially if you're my friend, or if you know me, or if you're nice. If you ask me before, you don't come to me talking, but you ask me, is it okay if I talk to you about this? Do you have the mental spoons to talk about this? If I say no, then obviously don't keep asking. But most of the time, it's not a bad thing to ask for help. Actually, in my opinion, in my experience, not with AuthorTube, but also just in general, again, things that have happened to me in my personal life, it's a lot less emotionally laborious to have a productive conversation with somebody I know and care about than to see them make a decision I disagree with on the pretense that they believed it was the best thing to do because they didn't want to emotionally strain me by asking a question. My thing here, too long didn't read, stop asking questions you could find the answers to on Google, but don't stop asking questions when you're taking our voice, our representation, into your hands. If you are trying to speak for an issue for people of color, talk to people of color. If you are trying to advocate for us, talk to one of us. This is not obviously going to be a monolithic thing. Not everybody's going to have the same opinions. But I think, at least for me, I would prefer somebody talk to me before they make a mistake, which mistakes are fine. If you want to ask a question but you feel scared to, I would interrogate, what is the question? Do I know this person? Would it be disrespectful for me to ask a stranger this? Or is this a friend of mine? Do they trust me? Do we have a good relationship? Have we had conversations about this before? You need to interrogate that on a personal level too. But I think in general, if you are talking for people of color or for marginalized people, or you are trying to advocate for them, really doing your research and hopefully speaking to somebody from that group, I think could be the most beneficial. And the last point this video is going to be to trade fear for empathy. I think that this fear of getting things wrong is based a lot on white fragility. I'm not going to lie. I'm grateful for the white writers out there who acknowledge that. I appreciate that people understand that. I understand this fear myself. I've felt this fear myself. And I think it is also, obviously not white fragility for me, I'm not white, but it is also a fragility, potentially of failure, this fear of failure. It is no justice for you, the world, or for your story to be so scared you remove diversity that you genuinely had good intentions with. Alexa said in her video that there are some things that essentially just can't be saved because they may inherently be problematic. She said something like that. Don't quote me. I would watch her video. And I agree with exactly what she said. I ask you, before you stress so much about writing diversely or trashing your project, to think empathetically. Sometimes I think, like what I said about what Alexa said, there are instances where there's nothing you can do to sort of save that. There are just some ideas that are inherently problematic. But like I said, I'm asking you to think empathetically. If you are really overthinking, some of the ideas that you have, they may not even be to the point where you need to trash them. So I ask you to think empathetically before you make a decision to remove all the diversity from your book, for example. I'm sure there are many of you who already think empathetically, but still have the fear. And I understand that. I'm a very empathetic person. I'm also a very fearful person. So I totally get that those things can coexist. I would say let go of the fear and voraciously welcome empathy. Be empathetic for the people you write and the multifaceted people they are. Be empathetic that your representation may be imperfect and someone may correct you, and be empathetic to the people you may hurt, even if that wasn't your intention. If you hurt somebody and that wasn't your intention, it's okay. Be empathetic to their feelings and know that it is okay to be imperfect. We all are imperfect. We will not be perfect at everything. Most of us will be forgiving of imperfection and mistakes. If there are people who are unwilling to forgive you, it's not your place to force them to forgive you. Be empathetic to the fact that people don't have to accept an apology and that people don't have to like your work, and that on the flip side, someone may find your representation comforting. Do not let fear tunnel you into writing an all-white story when you would have otherwise written a diverse one, because that's, to me, not really a solution to this problem. We can't fight the lack of diversity with even less diversity, especially when you belong to the dominant group of writers that the publishing industry actually publishes. I think it's unfortunate that the publishing industry doesn't publish as many diverse writers as they should. I think it's an injustice. But to make a change, the people in power, which in this instance would be white writers, you guys need to do something. My closing words here: do your research, put in the work, and be empathetic. And I still think that there's precarity with who can publish what. I do think so. I think that these cases are case to case. I think that they're complex, and I think that you need to interrogate them with complexity. It's not as simple as we can write whatever we want, and it's not as simple as stay in your lane. I think those are two extremes on different poles. And I think we need to find a middle ground between that. Just use your common sense and ask questions, do research, read books from the library, read academic articles, but most importantly, talk to people. Whether or not those are just people in your life, whether or not they're people from the marginalized group, whether or not that's people online, whether or not that's you talking to the textbook or answering questions from a textbook, talk about these things, having a conversation, letting in the voices that need to be heard, because I think there may be a tendency, and I say this because I've seen this in real life. I go to school in a very woke city, and because I go to school in a very woke city, I appreciate it because it's awesome. However, sometimes I think people think they know what's best for you, or they want the best for you, and so they try to do something that is helpful, when in reality it would have just been more helpful had they asked you. Whether or not they ask, hey, is this okay if I do this thing for you, or is this okay if I do this on behalf, like whatever, is this okay if I advocate for you? Obviously don't ask every single time. I think that it's practice to understand the balance, and I'm sorry if that's confusing for you. It's really practice and being open that you're going to make mistakes, being open with apologies, and being open with imperfection. Like I said, I think it's still really important that we are sort of working together on this. My community of color, can't do this without white writers, and we can't do it because white writers are the ones being published right now, and that's who the publishing industry seems to be putting their attention on. Until we fix that problem with the publishing industry, until we make the foundation a standable place, does that make sense? For all of us, it's not going to change. At least I don't think it will. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think it will in the capacity that we want it to. We need to change the structure. We need to hold the publishing industry accountable for these things. Again, I want to thank the people that I mentioned in this video, the articles, Alexa Dunn, Lizelle Sambury. I really appreciated hearing different perspectives on this. Really, please be kind to each other. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Of course, I am not the authority on everything because we all have different experiences, so let me know what you guys think in the description. I tried my best to be as coherent as possible, but I can tend to get a little bit passionate sometimes and talk in circles, so I hope that this was helpful for you guys. I would highly recommend just practicing empathy, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, and vividly feeling how that is passionately existing through somebody else's mind, not just existing through their mind for diversity points or whatever. So I hope that this video was helpful for you guys. My voice is really sore right now, and I will see you guys next week for another video. Bye.